this episode, we bring the whole course together by reviewing the major ideas that run across Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, CRISC, and turn the certification into one connected body of knowledge rather than a stack of separate topics. For a beginner, this kind of final review matters because a lot of exam anxiety comes from feeling like there are too many concepts floating around without a clear relationship to one another. The truth is that the certification becomes much easier to understand when you stop treating each domain like a different subject and start seeing how they fit into one continuous risk story inside an organization. That story begins with understanding the business, moves into identifying and analyzing risk, continues through responding to that risk in a practical way, and then depends on monitoring and reporting so leadership can judge whether the organization is actually improving. Once that bigger picture becomes clear, many topics that once felt abstract begin to make sense. The purpose of this review is not to cram new ideas into your head at the last moment, but to help you recognize the patterns that connect everything you have already studied. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong starting point for this review is the basic reason CRISC exists in the first place, which is to help professionals think about risk in a way that supports business objectives rather than treating security as a separate technical universe. The exam is built on the idea that organizations do not manage technology risk just to look responsible or satisfy paperwork. They manage it because business processes, customer trust, legal obligations, operational continuity, reputation, and financial performance all depend on technology working in a controlled and dependable way. That means the foundation of the certification is not a list of defensive tools. It is a decision-making model. What is the organization trying to achieve? What could interfere with those goals? How serious is the exposure? What should be done about it? And how will anyone know whether the response is actually working? If you remember that sequence, you already understand the spirit of the certification. Almost every domain concept can be traced back to that line of thinking. The exam is testing whether you can reason through that organizational logic, not whether you can impress anyone with isolated technical detail. The first major idea that supports everything else is governance, because risk management only works well when direction, accountability, and decision rights are clear. Governance tells the organization who is responsible for making decisions, who owns business objectives, who oversees risk, and how expectations are communicated. Without governance, even smart people can make inconsistent decisions because they are acting without clear structure. This is why topics such as organizational strategy, goals, roles, responsibilities, culture, policies, standards, and business processes matter so much early in CRISC. They are not background decoration. They form the environment in which risk is interpreted. A control that looks useful in one organization may be unnecessary, unaffordable, or poorly aligned in another because business priorities and operating models differ. Good governance helps leaders decide what matters most and who must act when exposure becomes visible. When reviewing for the exam, it helps to remember that governance is often the answer behind the answer. Many scenarios are really testing whether the organization has the structure and accountability needed to manage risk in a disciplined way. Business alignment is another key idea that stretches across all domains and often separates strong answers from merely technical ones. CRISC consistently expects you to think about risk in relation to business objectives, not in isolation from them. That means a risk is not important just because it sounds dangerous in a general sense. It becomes important because of its potential effect on operations, legal obligations, financial outcomes, service delivery, strategic plans, or stakeholder trust. This is one reason the certification keeps returning to organizational goals and business processes. If you do not understand what the organization values and how it functions, then you cannot judge risk in a meaningful way. A server outage, data exposure, vendor failure, or process weakness means something different depending on what the affected system supports and how the business depends on it. For exam purposes, this means the best answer often reflects business context, ownership, and impact rather than the answer that sounds most aggressive. Strong risk thinking always asks what the exposure means to the organization, not just what the technical issue looks like on its own. Once governance and business context are understood, the next major idea is risk identification, which is the disciplined effort to recognize what could go wrong before those problems become surprises. Risk identification includes looking at assets, processes, people, dependencies, threats, vulnerabilities, and potential events that could affect the organization's ability to achieve its goals. Beginners sometimes imagine that risk identification is just brainstorming bad things, but it is more structured than that. The organization needs to know what it depends on, where weaknesses exist, what kinds of internal or external events could create harm, and how those issues connect to business outcomes. This is also where ideas like enterprise risk management, the 3 lines of defense model, and risk profiles begin to matter. They help frame how risks are discovered, documented, communicated, and owned. On the exam, risk identification is rarely treated as random or purely reactive. It is part of a managed process, and the strongest answers usually respect that structure. If the organization cannot clearly identify relevant risks, then everything that follows becomes weaker because response decisions are only as good as the understanding behind them. After a risk has been identified, CRISC expects you to understand risk assessment, which is the process of evaluating the nature, likelihood, and impact of that risk so the organization can decide what deserves the most attention. This is one of the central skills in the certification because organizations cannot respond well to everything at the same level. They need to prioritize, compare, and judge exposure in a way that supports decision-making. Risk assessment is not only about assigning numbers or labels. It is about understanding how serious the consequence could be, how likely the event is to happen, and how prepared the organization is to handle it if it does. That means assessment involves both analysis and judgment. The exam often rewards answers that show a measured understanding of exposure rather than a reflexive desire to treat every issue as urgent. Good assessment also depends on understanding the existing control environment, because current safeguards influence what remains exposed. When you review this area, keep in mind that assessment is how the organization turns raw concern into usable decision information. Without it, leadership cannot prioritize wisely. A closely related concept is risk appetite and risk tolerance, which help explain how much uncertainty an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives. Beginners often confuse these ideas with carelessness, as if accepting any risk means management does not care about security. In reality, every organization accepts some risk because no environment can eliminate uncertainty entirely, and trying to remove all possible exposure would usually be unaffordable or operationally unrealistic. Risk appetite reflects the broad level of risk an organization is willing to take, while risk tolerance helps define the acceptable range around specific objectives or activities. These concepts matter on the exam because they influence response choices. A risk that one organization considers unacceptable may be temporarily tolerated by another because of cost, timing, strategic priorities, or operational dependency. That does not mean the second organization is wrong by definition. It means risk decisions must be interpreted within business context and governance. CRISC wants you to understand that mature risk management is not about always choosing the strongest possible control. It is about making defensible choices that fit the organization's stated direction and acceptable exposure levels. From there, the review naturally moves into risk response, which is where the organization decides what to do about the exposure it has identified and assessed. This part of the certification is important because it turns analysis into action. Typical response approaches include reducing risk through controls, accepting risk when exposure falls within approved limits, transferring some risk through contracts or other arrangements, or avoiding risk by changing the activity itself. The correct response depends on business impact, available resources, urgency, existing controls, and management priorities. One of the most important lessons across the domains is that response should be appropriate, not dramatic. A beginner may feel that the best answer is always the most forceful one, but the exam usually favors responses that are structured, owned, and aligned with the organization's actual needs. Response also depends on clear accountability. Someone must own the business risk, Someone must help manage the controls, and someone must communicate status to the right people. If you remember anything from this part of the review, remember that response is where judgment becomes visible. It shows whether the organization can act on its understanding in a practical and responsible way. Controls sit at the center of many CRISC conversations, so a final review should make their role very clear. Controls are the safeguards, practices, processes, and mechanisms used to reduce risk, detect problems, correct weaknesses, or support accountability. They may be administrative, technical, physical, preventive, detective, or corrective, but the core idea is always the same. A control should support the organization's ability to operate within acceptable risk limits. What matters on the exam is not memorizing endless control categories in a disconnected way. What matters is understanding why a control exists, what risk it addresses, whether it is designed appropriately, and whether it is working as intended. A control that looks impressive on paper may still be weak if it is poorly aligned, inconsistently applied, or not monitored. This is why the certification repeatedly connects controls to risk assessment and monitoring. Controls are not trophies. They are tools in a larger management process. Good answers on the exam often show that a control should be judged in relation to business objectives, ownership, and residual exposure rather than admired simply because it sounds strong. Residual risk is another concept that becomes much easier once you think in practical terms. It refers to the risk that remains after controls or response measures have been applied. This matters because organizations do not manage risk by pretending controls make every problem disappear. They manage risk by understanding what level of exposure remains and whether that remaining exposure is acceptable. On the exam, this concept often appears indirectly in questions about effectiveness, ongoing concern, or whether further action is needed. A professional with good judgment does not stop at saying a control exists. The better question is whether the control reduces the relevant risk enough to satisfy business and governance expectations. If not, then leadership may need stronger safeguards, better monitoring, a different process, or formal acceptance of what remains. This is one of the reasons monitoring and reporting are so important in CRISC. They help the organization understand whether actual conditions match assumptions. Residual risk reminds you that risk management is about informed decisions under uncertainty, not about unrealistic promises of total protection or perfect certainty. Monitoring is where the certification starts to feel especially real because organizations do not manage risk effectively by making one good decision and then walking away. Conditions change, threats evolve, people make mistakes, systems age, business priorities shift, and controls that once seemed sufficient may no longer be enough. Monitoring is the ongoing effort to observe indicators, evaluate control performance, detect change, and provide leadership with information about whether risk remains within acceptable bounds. This is why key performance information, control testing, trend analysis, issue tracking, and ongoing review all matter in the broader CRISC picture. Monitoring supports learning. It tells the organization whether its assumptions were accurate and whether its responses are still appropriate. For the exam, this means that risk management is never presented as a one-time event. It is a cycle. A risk is identified, assessed, addressed, and then monitored so the organization can decide what comes next. That cyclical view is one of the most important themes to remember because it ties the domains together more clearly than any isolated definition ever could. Reporting is closely linked to monitoring because information has little value if it does not reach the right people in a form they can understand and act on. Reporting in CRISC is not just about creating documents or dashboards. It is about communication that supports decision-making. Different audiences need different kinds of information. Senior leaders usually care about business impact, major exposures, trend direction, and whether actions align with objectives and appetite. Operational teams may need more detailed information about control performance, incidents, weaknesses, and required follow-up. A strong answer on the exam often reflects this awareness that reporting should be relevant, timely, and audience-appropriate. Poor reporting can create false confidence, delay action, or overwhelm leaders with details that do not help them decide anything. Good reporting, by contrast, strengthens governance because it connects risk information to accountability and action. During final review, It helps to remember that the exam values communication not as a soft skill floating outside the technical world, but as a core management function. Risk management fails quietly when the right information does not reach the right decision makers at the right time. Another thread running through all domains is ownership, because risk management only works when responsibility is clear. Many questions across CRISC are really asking whether the right person or function is accountable for a decision, a process, a control, or a business outcome. This is where beginners sometimes get confused by assuming the security team owns every risk issue simply because technology is involved. In reality, business owners are often accountable for accepting or addressing risks that affect their objectives, while control specialists, risk professionals, auditors, and security teams provide support, analysis, assurance, and operational capability. That distinction matters because governance breaks down when everyone assumes someone else is responsible. Clear ownership makes escalation meaningful, reporting useful, and response decisions defensible. It also connects directly to the 3 lines of defense model, which helps explain how different groups contribute to managing and overseeing risk without collapsing into one another's roles. If you are reviewing for the exam, keep asking yourself who owns the objective, who manages the control activity, who provides oversight, and who needs the information. That question alone can unlock many otherwise difficult scenarios. A final review should also remind you that culture matters more than beginners often expect. Organizational culture influences whether policies are followed, whether people report problems early, whether risk conversations are honest, and whether control expectations are treated as business responsibilities or annoying side tasks. A strong risk program in a weak culture often struggles because people may avoid accountability, hide issues, rush around governance, or treat controls as obstacles rather than safeguards. On the other hand, a healthy culture supports consistency, transparency, escalation, and shared responsibility. This topic matters on CRISC because risk management is never only mechanical. It depends on people behaving in ways that allow governance and controls to function. Culture helps explain why 2 organizations with similar documents and similar tools may experience very different outcomes. For exam purposes, culture is often the hidden factor behind whether risk processes work in practice. A good review mindset is to remember that risk management is both structural and human. Policies, controls, and reporting matter, but people still determine whether those mechanisms are respected and used well. As we close this final review, the most useful takeaway is that the domains are best understood as one connected process for helping organizations make better decisions under uncertainty. Governance provides direction and accountability. Business understanding gives risk its context. Identification reveals what could go wrong. Assessment helps leadership judge significance and priority. Response determines what should be done. Controls support that response. Monitoring shows whether the organization is improving or drifting. Reporting turns observation into decision support. Ownership makes accountability real, and culture influences whether the whole system works as intended. If you carry that integrated picture into the exam, you will be far less likely to feel lost in isolated terminology or distracted by answer choices that sound good but break the logic of the larger process. CRISC is ultimately about disciplined judgment in service of business objectives, and that is why this summary matters. When you remember the story that connects the domains, you are not just reviewing content. You are reviewing the way the certification expects you to think.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.